All right, welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is James Carroll. This is our Biblical Scholarship and Literacy class. We're going to talk about, normally we talk about the Bible, we tell stories about the Bible, and we talk about what scholarship has taught us about what it means. I want to remind everyone that we have a web page that goes along with the course, and so when I upload YouTube videos of the lectures, if you miss a lecture, you can see it on the YouTube channel. It also has links to notes, to user things, to handouts, extra reading, that sort of thing is on there. And here is the URL if you want to find it. Unfortunately, it's a bad URL, but that's because I'm using a free service. Sites.google.com gives you free hosting places, and I'm using View, Biblical Scholarship, and Literacy. So that's the path to the web page, where you can go to find the YouTube videos if you miss a class, or you can find links to handouts, extra reading, etc. I also have here a bunch of handouts for this class. I'm going to pass these out. I'm going to spread those out and put the extras in the back somewhere. And we'll use those today. If you remember last month, we talked about Jacob and Esau. We talked about how he wrestled with an angel. We talked about his vision of the ladder up to heaven, etc. And what was supposed to be next is I wanted to spend a little more time talking about ancient Near Eastern initiation rituals, and I want to compare that to the wrestling scene we had where Jacob wrestled with the angel. That was really obscure, and we hit it at the end. We talked about how it fit into the story, but I want to go back and try to tell you what it meant and what it represents by showing you how it fits into ancient Near Eastern initiation rituals. And then we're going to move on and talk about Joseph and his absolutely amazing Technicolor dream coat. So that's what was planned to be next. However, it just so happens that today is Easter. Now, it's probably not if you're watching it online, but if you're here with me right now, today is Easter. And I couldn't imagine teaching Joseph, which is an interesting story, on Easter. I mean, there are some things you can tie to Easter, but I just couldn't imagine. I thought I ought to talk about Easter. But this isn't an Easter class or a Christianity class. It's a biblical class. So I had to tie it to the Bible somehow. So I figured what I would do today was I would tell the stories of the Israelite festivals, because Easter is a Christian festival. So I thought we're in the Old Testament. I'd talk about Old Testament Israelite biblical festivals, their holy weeks, their sacred calendar. And after we did that, we would just then tie it in to Easter at the end and talk about how the biblical calendar of the Jews ties into the Christian calendar and where it came from and what the holy days of the Christian church are. So first to start, and then we'll do Joseph next month. So to start, when we start talking about a sacred calendar, we have to talk about what is sacred and what is sacred space and sacred time. We're usually familiar with sacred space. A sacred space is a temple. It's a special place you go to perform rituals that can only be performed there, that you worship there. Well, what makes a place special? Usually some event happened there, or there was a special dedication service there, or a special building was built there with boundaries and walls. The bottom left, I have a picture of the Temple of Herod, and it has certain boundaries and walls that delineate different levels of sacred space. Right? And they're increasingly exclusive as you go further and further into the Holy of Holies, which is the most sacred spot at the back. And so, only Israelites can go here, and then, including women, only men can go here, priests can go here, only the high priest can go here, and it's increasingly exclusive. So the idea is you put certain things into sacred places, like rituals, dedications, and you exclude other things that are impure from those sacred spaces, or that you consider impure, and that makes the place special, sacred. Well, the same is true when you think of time. We think of time as having even beats because of our watches and our clocks, right? Time moves at the same speed, feels the same. But if you think about it, it's not. The weekend is different than the week. You've got to work on the week. On the weekend, you get to rest. Friday is a special day because you get to go out and have dates, right? And so it's true that time itself actually has a different flavor depending on the day and on what you do. And so just like space, what you do is you exclude certain things from certain days and you include certain things in those days, and it makes time special. By sacred, I mean how you feel. Like when you go into a sacred place, you feel different. When you go into sacred time, you feel different if you make that time sacred, special. We go to church every week, and we get to listen to John give his wonderful sermons, and it feels different. We get to embrace in a community, and that sense of community is one of the things we use to create a sacred time every Sunday when we meet together. It creates a feeling. The other thing is that myths and rituals, and therefore the sacred space they define, are tied together. So, for example, here we have the tabernacle of Moses that the Israelites carried with them. This is a sacred space they carried with them. Here we have a depiction of the events of the Exodus, specifically the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Right? There's the altar where they offered sacrifices and covenanted to obey the law. There's the rock that Moses smote with his rod that gave forth water. There's the burning bush, and there's the cloud veil that separated Moses from God, who sat upon his throne with the 2 tables of stone that he touched with his finger. So, of course, in the temple you have the altar. You have the basin of water that you use to wash yourself with. You have the burning bush as this menorah lampstand that's in the shape of a tree or bush. And then you have the veil that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And in the back you have the ark, which explicitly represents the throne of God. And inside you put the tables of stone that Moses touched with his finger. So the idea here is that myths and rituals are connected. The myth explains the ritual. And by myth, I don't mean something negative or I'm not implying that something didn't happen or something that's fictional. By myth, I just mean a sacred story. A sacred story, in a religious context. I'm using it in kind of a technical term here. And so the myth was written in a way that explains the ritual, and the ritual was modified and created in a way that informs the myth, and the two feed on each other in a way that it's very difficult to pry apart which came first, the chicken or the Easter egg. The bunny or the Easter egg. And so when we talk about Israel creates sacred time. And the best example of this is the Sabbath. Right? On the Sabbath, you don't work. You exclude certain things. And you do certain things. You have ritual lighting of candles, etc., that commemorate the Sabbath. So you do things that are sacred, and you exclude things that are profane, and you make a space for a time frame that feels different than other times, that is sacred, that is the Sabbath. And I know in Christian circles it's sometimes popular to almost denigrate or make fun of the Jewish way they follow the Sabbath, right? You can't even pick up a stick. You can't, right? And they're very legalistic with all these rules and laws, and so they're missing the whole point in the spirit. And in fact, Jesus often would heal on the Sabbath specifically because he was asking the question, is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? Because he was breaking one of their legalistic rules. And I grew up in that culture, and I felt that way until I went to Israel, and I met a Jewish family, and I watched how they participated in the Sabbath, and how the things they excluded, just like you exclude things from a temple that are profane to keep it sacred, the things they excluded from that time wasn't something that they felt legalistically bound to do. It was something they chose to do because it helped that time feel different. And in everything they did, they had to count their steps, and they had to think about, whether they were moving an object from this person to this person, because you can't trade objects, right? And they were thinking about all this stuff. Can I turn on a light? And that meant everything they did created the thought that made that space of time sacred for them. And it created a very powerful experience for the people who chose to worship or to sacralize their time in that way. Now, the Israelites don't just have weekly festivals, they also have yearly festivals. And to talk about the yearly festivals of the Jewish calendar, the yearly sacred times, just like the Sabbath is a weekly sacred time, we have to talk about their calendar. And calendars are boring, and they have a lot of numbers involved, and you try to figure out all this stuff. And the reason calendars are so complicated is because we're trying to count days and associate the days with years and months. And the thing is, the month is related to the moon, and year is related to the sun, and day is related to the speed at which the earth spins on its axis. So you've got the spin of the earth on the axis, the spin of the earth around the sun, and the spin of the moon around the earth, and you put all that stuff together, and you know what? They don't line up. In other words, the months don't even line up on even days, and the years don't line up on even months or days, and so calendars become really complicated. Well, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, primarily. And what we mean by a lunar calendar is that every full moon, the month starts over. Is it the full moon or the new moon? I don't remember. But every phase of the month, I believe it's the full moon. At every phase of the month, on the full moon, their calendar starts over for the next month. So they divide their months based on the moon. The problem is if you do that, your calendar floats relative to the time of year, the solar calendar. The solar calendar will slowly float around, and that means when spring will be on a different month every year. And you get further and further off the further you go. So what they would do is every 13 months, or every so many years, they would add an extra month to the year to kind of recorrect the calendar back to the solar calendar. And even that doesn't work perfectly, but it keeps you close. And so these are the Jewish, the Israelite months coming around here. And these are our months in here. And again, they aren't perfect because the number of days in their months doesn't match the number of days in our months, and so they slowly float. This is going to be important when we start asking questions like why is Easter when it is and that sort of thing. Okay, so then they have things that are tied to the sun, and that was their agricultural cycle. Because they live in the Mediterranean, so that their climate is fairly mild. They don't have deep winters. So spring doesn't mean for them quite what it means for us. But they did have a rainy season and a dry season and a wet season, and they had fruits that they would grow, and the fruits, had evolved from things that sometimes lived in northern latitudes, and so they would flower and produce fruit at one time, but you could decide when the grain was going to produce fruit based on when you planted it. And so what you had was an agricultural season that had various times when you would harvest. And so there were these harvest times, and what we've done here is we've put the harvests and the agricultural season and the festivals on the outside of the calendar to show kind of when they show up. And so their festivals seem to have an agricultural origin, meaning they're tied to harvest times, specific harvest times. And there's a handout that is either in the video description if you're online, or I've passed the thing out, and it looks something like that. And at the top, it has a list of all of the festivals and every biblical reference to those festivals I could find. And in the bottom, it's got a copy of their calendar, so you can see when they happen and also the months they happen on if you kind of convert to our months. And there's a range because these events happen, when you convert to our calendar within a range of time. They don't fall on a specific time. So those are the Israelite biblical festivals. And this is that top part. There's the festival of unleavened bread, which includes the sub-festival of Passover and first fruits. And actually, we probably think there were two festivals and they kind of merged. And the text says that this is the beginning of months for you. In other words, this is the first month of the year. Passover is a New Year's festival, and it is also the barley harvest. However, it just so happens that the Feast of Trumpets here, Tabernacles, Rosh Hashanah is also, Rosh means head of the year, Rosh Hashanah. That's their New Year's. And so the Bible is schizophrenic about what the New Year is. Is the New Year at Passover or is the New Year at Rosh Hashanah? And the reason for that is because the biblical tradition, the likely reason for that is the biblical tradition evolved from several subcultures that they borrowed these festivals from. And there was probably one group that had a New Year's festival at Passover time. And there was probably another group that had a New Year's festival at Rosh Hashanah time. And the Jews merged these, and they have a culture that now has two competing New Year's festivals that they have to figure out which is the New Year. And so the way they do it is they list both of them as the New Year. And the way I've done it in this handout, and I think the way most people kind of interpret it today, is one is the political New Year, and the other is the agricultural New Year. And that way you get two New Years. And so that's why there's two month dating systems on the handout you've got. Okay, enough of kind of that trivia. These are the three main festivals. And in the handout, it actually has the months in between. But here's the religious numbering. Month 1 gives us Passover. Month 3, Pentecost. Month 7, trumpets. Or month 1 if you're in the political New Year. And so that would make this 7 and this 9. So those are the two numbers. These are the names of the months. These are the modern dates on which they fall. These are the agricultural events that they are tied to. And so you see here the rains begin and you have a general harvest time, and then you plant the wheat and the barley. So here's our Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and Trumpets. So let's talk about what happens on each of these. Now, if you go to a class on Judaism, or when I teach a class on Judaism as a comparative religion, we will do these in greater detail. But here I just want to give a 3-word summary of each festival, so you get an idea of the sort of things that exist. So the first is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which includes Passover, and first fruits. Again, these are the biblical references. Those are the dates in the Jewish lunar calendar, and kind of falls in somewhere in March or April. This will obviously then be connected to Easter in a second, because it's the March and April spring festival. It commemorates, originally it was probably an agricultural festival that we believe the Jews celebrated before the Exodus. In fact, the text itself says, Pharaoh, you need to let us go so that we may worship God in a festival. That's why he says to let them go. I mean, we forgot that. We don't even read that. We don't notice. But he says, we have a festival. We have to worship God in this festival. You got to let us go so we can worship God at our festival. And there's this festival coming. Let us go. So the festival seems to, according to the text and according to kind of the archaeological evidence and stuff, the festival, not archaeological, but kind of the cultural evidence, the festival appears to predate the Exodus. However, the Exodus it's evolved so that the Exodus is what you celebrate on the festival. So they had a pre-existing thing, and then it evolved and incorporated the pre-existing festival and turned it into something that you use to commemorate the Exodus. This is a theme we will see. The Christians will do this, right? Christmas is borrowed from, the green tree and all that stuff is borrowed from all these other traditions. This is normal procedure, right? The biblical tradition borrows from a pre-existing festival and turns it into a celebration of the Exodus. So, the Exodus is when Moses comes and delivers the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt, parts the Red Sea. You're familiar with this story, I assume, to some degree. It is celebrated by eating unleavened bread. And as they turn it into a celebration of the Exodus, the reason they give is because when we left, leaven is yeast. Our bread didn't have time to rise. The yeast didn't have time to work. We had to bake it before the yeast made it rise. So you eat bread that is unrisen without yeast. And that's to commemorate the Exodus when we had to leave in a hurry. The other thing that they did is during the Exodus, they sacrificed a lamb, and they painted the posts and lintel of their door with the blood of the lamb, and then they ate the flesh of the lamb that they sacrificed in a special communal meal called the Passover Seder. And then, as they painted the blood on their door, when the angel of death came, and it passed over the children of Israel, which is where the term Passover comes, and it slew all the firstborn children of Egypt, but spared all the firstborn children of Israel. So this is the lamb that sets the children of Israel free, because this is what softens Pharaoh's heart and causes him to let them go. So this is the lamb that brings freedom. This is the lamb that brought deliverance from death from the children of Israel, which the Egyptians didn't have, and they died, etc. And that event set the children of Israel free. I should also mention that there's a sense of justice in the text, because the Pharaoh was killing all the male children of Israel. And so this death of the male children of Israel prefigures the death of the Egyptian children in the Passover event, when the angel comes and slays all the Egyptian children. In Israel today, it is, and in Jewish communities today, all over the world, it is celebrated with unleavened bread. A Haggadah is called. It's a book with, and lots of Jewish communities write their own. I wrote my own Haggadah for fun one day. But it tells the story of the Exodus, and it has a ritual that's prescribed for how you celebrate. That ritual includes washing each other's hands, and drinking 4 cups of wine. And there's this plate with eggs on it. Well, let's go through the plate quickly. There are symbols of growth, new birth, eggs, and spring of parsley, new growth. You also have toil and slavery in Egypt. You have something that represents the mortar and bricks, bitter herbs that represent the hardness of the labor, and the salt water that represents the tears of the Israelites and as they suffered in Egypt. And you have a lamb bone that represents that lamb that was sacrificed. Now, in biblical times, they would offer lamb as a sacrifice at the temple, and then eat it in their own homes as part of Passover. After the temple was destroyed, they stopped doing that. So you don't eat lamb as part of the festival anymore because you can't offer it as sacrifice. But the bone is left to remind you of the Paschal lamb that was offered. So this is the plate. I've got one here. So this is my Passover plate, and we used to do Passover every year. It was a lot of fun, but it was also a lot of work, so we kind of quit. But if you want, maybe next year we'll do a Passover, and all of you can come, and we'll do it here in the church or something if I can get some people to help me. But it's a lot of fun, and we can go through the Haggadah, although I have to change it. It's still a Mormon Haggadah. I'll have to write a Unitarian one or something. But there's my Haggadah plate, and so this, which we would use when we did Passover. So let's also talk about the Festival of Weeks. This is the next one, and it is called Shavuot, Pentecost, or Harvest. And the idea here is that it comes so many days after Passover. So Passover represents the Exodus, and this comes so many days after, and so it represents the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And so it's a very law-centric festival. In fact, it's one of the few that the Bible itself doesn't give a list of commandments that you have to follow when you celebrate the Festival of Weeks. So there are no commandments, but it does talk about the purpose. The purpose is to commemorate the giving of the law. So these are the references, the biblical references. It is associated with the wheat harvest. So if Passover was the barley harvest, now you're harvesting the wheat, and celebrating the giving of the law. Of course, Pentecost is also that day in the New Testament where the Spirit descended on everybody and they got the Holy Ghost and spoke in tongues, if you remember and that's where we get Pentecostal churches today, is all based on that idea. But it's the celebration of giving of the law, which is a good place for Christians to receive the Holy Ghost, which is their new law that guides them in how they act and behave. In general, Jews will celebrate this by bringing out the Torah, and they read the book of Ruth, and there's some other things that they tend to do. But these are traditions. Again, there's no kind of biblical command telling you what you do on the day of Pentecost. So now we get the fall festival complex, and then we're going to move into Easter. I call this a complex because there are at least 3 different festivals that group together within a few days. So they kind of go together in a group. There's trumpets, Rosh Hashanah. There's the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and Tabernacles, which is this festival of booth, gathering, etc., which we'll talk about. So let's start with Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year. This is the political New Year's Eve. And the most famous thing they do at Rosh Hashanah is they take a ram's horn, something like this, ram's horn, and I probably am not going to do a very good job, but we'll see if I can make this make noise. I can't, apparently. Right, this is a nice ram's horn. So, and if you get a really good one, you can play tunes on it. And I've been able to make about 2 notes, but I can't make any more than 2, and I can't do that reliably, so I'm not going to try. But I was really excited when I found this in Israel. It was a nice, small enough size that it wasn't too expensive, and I could bring it home and keep it to use as kind of a show and tell thing. In fact, if you want, I'll pass this around. It has a certain smell to it because it's a real ram's horn that they've hollowed out, and you can use it to play notes, and it's a nice instrument. I'll pass it around for you, for those who want to see it. A shofar. So again, the things you do here, this is a New Year's festival. There's a lot more associated with it, but we're going to move on just for lack of time. But it is associated with Yom Kippur, and the reason it's associated with Yom Kippur is it's on 1st of Tishri. Yom Kippur is 10th of Tishri. So 10 days after the New Year's, you get together, and the high priest, the Yom Kippur is is considered the most holy day in the Jewish calendar for Jews wherever they live, but the ritual prescribed are all priest rituals. These are things the priest does and the high priest. They're not really things the individual does. So the individual on Yom Kippur doesn't work and celebrates by fasting and then feasting at the end. And so what you can think of it like this. On New Year's Day, the fates are decried. That's what happened in the ancient Near East. On New Year's, you would set the fates for the coming year, and you were judged for the events of last year. And if you really contemplate your own past year's behavior, you realize you didn't do a very good job of living up to everything you believe and you should do. And you've sinned and you've done wrong things. So, what do you do about that? Well, you fast then for 10 days. to try to overcome the fact that you failed last year, you fast for 10 days until you get to Yom Kippur, and then the priest would offer a cleansing ritual to cleanse the temple of all the impurity that accumulated in the temple complex itself over the last year. And that, in other words, my bad actions they thought they actually accumulated in the temple and made the temple itself impure, and the high priest would cleanse that temple in a ritual that involved entering the Holy of Holies just once every year on this day. And then he would emerge from the Holy of Holies after sprinkling blood from sacrifices there. He would emerge out of the Holy of Holies, raise his hands over above his head, and give a blessing and pronounce the name of the Lord for the congregation to hear. And in fact, this is the only time the name of the Lord was spoken in later Judaism, not in earlier times. So, the other thing, you would get two goats, and you would draw lots. One of them for Azazel, a demon. It's the name of a demon in the wilderness. And the other for Yahweh, the Lord. And you would put these two placards on their heads, one for the goat on the left hand, one for the lamb for God, for Yahweh on the right hand. So one was placed on the right hand, one on the left. And the one on the right was sacrificed. And that became the lamb for Jehovah, or that represents Jehovah, who is sacrificed on the Day of Atonement. And the other is cast out into the wilderness. And that's where the dwelling of the demon and the devil is. And if you think about what's happening here, there are two penalties for sin and transgression that show up in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. One is death, and the other is expulsion. So because Adam ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, he's kicked out of the garden, expelled, and he becomes mortal, subject to death. And so here we have the two penalties for the sins of the people being scapegoated. That's where we get the term scapegoat. One is killed for the sins of the people. The other is expelled from the congregation for the sins of the people and carries the impurities off into the wilderness. Now this has, just like we talked about how there was probably an agricultural earlier root to this. Well, there's also a pagan festival that is the root of this Day of Atonement ritual. It's a Babylonian festival called the Akitu festival, where, among other things, they would sacrifice a lamb, and they would actually scrub the temple with the lamb's body coat and get all the impurities off, and then they would sacrifice it, then they'd throw it into a river, and it would carry that off into the wilderness. And so they had one lamb that represented both the scapegoat and the lamb for Yahweh, both in one, but it had served the same purpose. The sacrificing of this animal carried off the impurities of the people into the wilderness, and there was all sorts of other things that went on in the Akitu ritual that are mirrored in the Day of Atonement ritual, and in Rosh Hashanah, because the Akitu festival is the New Year's festival for Babylon. It's the Babylonian New Year's festival. So we can see this kind of borrowing from pagan traditions to create our own festival, but changing kind of the meaning in the interpretation. The next one is Sukkot. It's called a Feast of Tabernacles, booths, or ingathering, and it was on the 15th to the 21st, which is 5 days after Yom Kippur. And this is the time of the general harvest, when you set, there was wheat, barley, and then you kind of harvest everything else, all the fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing would come at this point. And it had pieces to it, including a sacred assembly on the 22nd. And what you do when you celebrate this one is you make little booths, and you live in these kind of little booth, almost tents. And again, this is interpreted in the later biblical text as being remembering how we had to live in temporary dwellings when we wandered in the wilderness. They tie it back to the Exodus. But it probably originated in an agricultural tradition where you would actually go out into the fields and live in little tents and booths while you all got together and harvested all the stuff. And then you would bring all the food in and you would have a party, just like we have kind of Thanksgiving, right? You have a feast, the same thing with Passover. After you harvest, you have a feast and to celebrate the fact that you've got all this food that you brought in and you have a Thanksgiving. And they would also they would circumambulate certain sacred spots, and they would hold up these they're not palm fronds necessarily, but they have, I think, 5 specific plants that they wind together in almost a wand sort of thing, and they wave them in the air and cry, Hosanna. That should sound very, very familiar to those of us who are familiar with Palm Sunday. So that gives us a festival complex that is all tied together. Oh, by the way, Hosanna means save us now, and it is a cry anticipating the Messiah or the coming of the Messiah who would save them. Asking the Messiah to come and save them. So if you think about this, you have a New Year where you were judged and found wanting. You have 10 days of fasting, followed by a ritual of purification done by the priest, followed by a ritual where everyone gathers at the temple, builds these temporary things, lives out of them for a while, and then celebrates the fact that because of Yom Kippur and their own repentance process, they have been forgiven, and they can celebrate, and they can ask for the Messiah to come and save them. And that is the fall festival complex. Let's talk for a minute about Easter. Now we're going to try to tie all this together. By the way, studying Easter is hard. I asked my wife to look some stuff up, and these were the top hits she found. I love this one. The truth about Easter. You always know you found somebody who's not going to tell you the truth when they talk about, we're going to tell you the truth and no one else knows it. The truth about Easter, right? And then look who it's by, the ADP Homeschooling Association. I'm sure they know exactly what they're talking about. It's hard, and the reason it's hard is because there are 3 perspectives you will see that bubble to the top of any Google search result you do if you look for the origins of Easter. One is anti-Christians who have a very specific agenda, and that is to show that Easter is a pagan ritual, borrowed from pagans, and therefore all of Christianity is stupid. And this is, of course, really silly because it doesn't matter if I borrow something and reinterpret it. It's still a fun ritual that maybe even God might approve. I mean, that's a dumb argument. But the other argument you get is you get these apologetic Christians who like to say, Easter has nothing to do with pagan rituals. It's all from God. It's revelation. It has nothing to, there was no borrowing. None. No borrowing. Not allowed. This is also stupid because what they're doing is they're saying there was no pagan element to this ritual. Well, we know that's not true. In fact, borrowing from these pagan and these earlier agricultural festivals was the modus operandi of the Old Testament. We just showed that Passover and Weeks and Day of Atonement is borrowed from the Akitu festival. That's normal. That's how this works, right? If you apply that tradition to the Bible, you're in a lot of trouble. And so, again, that's silly and stupid. So we don't. Those people aren't helpful either. And then we get these. They get these fundamentalist Christians, and what they will say is, because Easter was borrowed from pagan traditions, you cannot celebrate Easter because it's not Christian. And of course, this is silly too, for similar reasons. Again, if you were to apply that to the biblical tradition, you have a problem with the entire Pentateuch and all the festivals. The Temple of Solomon looks exactly like a Syrian temple. Same rooms, same floor plan, same pillars, and it's clearly borrowed from the pagan rituals. And if you really believe that, you can't believe in the temple, you can't believe in anything, right? So again, these approaches are not helpful. The approach you want is someone who says, where did Easter come from? Let's look at the history. Wherever it leads, let's look at the pagan similarities. Let's kind of presume some sort of maybe borrowing in it and kind of evolution of this tradition. And then let's talk about how the Christians use it to represent what they want to represent and celebrate, which is the life of Christ and how it's been borrowed and adapted. And without any sort of judgment about what that means in terms of, so you don't want to deny the pagan elements, but you don't necessarily need to come to the same conclusions because of them either. Because once you do that, you also are biased. And a lot of the people who do this come up with really dumb solutions. I'll show you a couple in a minute. So why does Easter float around? And Christmas kind of sits still. Christmas is always on the same day every year, and Easter's always moving around. Well, it's because Easter is tied to Passover. And Passover was set on a lunar calendar, and it moved around. Christmas was chosen during the Julian calendar had already been created, and then it was adapted into the Gregorian calendar later. And so that was a solar calendar that we still use, and those dates don't move around. And so they just chose to commemorate something every year on the same date on the calendar they had, which was their solar calendar. When they got to Passover and Easter, they said, well, wait a minute, this is tied to Passover. And Passover is a Jewish festival. It's on the lunar, and it moves around. And so they started tying Easter to Passover, and then it would move around, which they didn't do for Christmas because there was no corresponding Jewish festival to tie it to. So why is it called Easter? This is another point of sometimes contention. The Venerable Bede, a British, I don't know if that's how you say his name, he's a British monk who lived in the late 17th and early 18th century, wrote that the month in which English Christians were celebrating the resurrection of Jesus had been called Esturmonnoth in Old English, referring to a goddess named Eostre, supposedly. And even though Christians had been affirming the Christian meaning of the celebration, they continued to use the name of the goddess to distinguish the season. And this is quoted from America's Favorite Holidays, A Candid Histories by this guy named Bruce David Forbes. So that's why we call it Easter. Something to point out, though, is that it's only called Easter in English and German. And we are the minority of languages. In fact, everywhere else in the Latin world and in the rest of Christianity, it's named something related to Pasach or Passover. And so it's named after Passover almost everywhere you go, except in Germany and England, where it's named Easter because they had a name for this pagan goddess Eostre that was celebrated, had a spring celebration on that month, and so that name stuck. Now, this is an argument that people will then make. Easter is all the worship of this goddess. Well, no, it's not. It's only the worship of that goddess if you happen to live in England and Britain, and it's only the name of that goddess because that was the calendar name and they were associated. And we still have Odin's Day. It's called Wednesday, right? And so that doesn't mean Wednesday is a celebration of Odin. It's just that's the name, and the name has an etymology and a history. However, there are elements that clearly do borrow from pagan traditions. These are late elements added into Easter. There's the Easter bunny, and there's the eggs and the baskets, and we're going to go out and have an Easter egg hunt, and it's a lot of fun. Those elements are they have pagan parallels, and they're almost certainly pagan in origin, and they've been borrowed into the Easter festival. And in fact, the very idea of a spring festival is celebrated all around the world. Everyone has one, including ancient Israel. It's called Passover. And there was a ritual and a celebration before that was also pagan in origin, that then turned into Passover, that then turned into Easter. And so if you read too much into that, you come up with really silly conclusions like this one. This is Ishtar, pronounced Easter. No, that is not actually how you pronounce Ishtar. Easter was originally the celebration of Ishtar. No, it wasn't. Although there are spring celebrations for these pagan deities, but nevertheless. And Asherah and Babylonian goddesses of fertility and sex. Actually, they are not Babylonian goddesses of fertility and sex, although there are fertility elements, but she's also a goddess of war and power and all sorts of other interesting things. Her symbols, like the egg and the bunny, Ishtar is not connected to the egg or the bunny. She has nothing to do with those, although she is connected to lions and owls and stars and other funny, interesting things. But they were still, and still are, fertility and sex symbols. Did you actually think eggs and bunnies had anything to do with the resurrection? After Constantine decided that to Christianize the empire, Easter was changed to represent Jesus. Well, that is true. They did have spring festivals that were adapted into Easter because they tried to get people to worship and celebrate Easter, the celebration of Christ, instead of these other spring festivals they were celebrating before. That's probably the only true statement in here, although it's got all sorts of interesting spin to it. It isn't necessary. Let's see. Easter was changed to represent Jesus, but at its roots, Easter, which is how you pronounce Ishtar, no, it's not, is all about celebrating fertility and sex. Well, fertility and sex are obviously connected to spring. That's what spring is all about. Other than that, this is fairly well stupid. And I love that Richard Dawkins Foundation is the people who published this because it's all about reason over superstition of religion, and they don't seem to be able to get their reason right. If you're going to be reasonable and logical about things, it helps if you actually know what you're talking about. So again, Ishtar and Easter appear to be homophones. They sound similar. They're not pronounced the same, but they have different meanings and probably different originations. You can hypothesize that maybe Ishtar and the Eostre are related, but they actually were celebrated. We believe that the Indo-European goddess actually had different connotations than Ishtar. They celebrated different things, they worshiped different things, and they were connected to different things. The only thing they have in common is fertility and possibly a spring festival, maybe. And we aren't even sure of that. So again, what matters, I think, in this context is what do Christians think Easter means? Because, well, first of all, from the very beginning, I don't believe it's possible to accidentally worship the devil, right? And I know that seems like a segue, but give me a second. The fundamentalist Christians who complain about this will say, if you celebrate Easter, you're actually worshiping fertility and sex, you're not really worshiping Jesus, so you're going to go to hell, so you can't worship Easter. That's a fundamentalist Christian position that some will take. And again, if you believe in God, I don't believe God judges us based on whether we whether we go out and look for Easter eggs and accidentally worship the goddess of sex instead of him. he celebrates us and judges us based on our intent, which is what C.S. Lewis said. Right? Every act that is done with good intent is celebrates me, and every act done with wrong intent is given to the devil. Doesn't matter who you think you're worshiping. And I believe if there is a God, that's how he behaves. So I'm not so worried about that. What we need to think about is, what is the intent whenever you do this of a ritual, of any ritual, any other religion. If you're going to look at another religion and ask, what do they believe, what do they do? You ask, what does it mean to them? Not what does it mean, because I can determine that it actually is worshiping the devil and they don't even know it. No, but what does it mean to them? What do they think it means? So what do modern Christians think Easter means? What does it mean to them? Well, for them, it's the story of Jesus. So let's tell that story. Jesus is a myth, and again, I'm using that term myth in the non-derogatory. It's a story with ritual and symbolic and religious connotations for the people who believe in it. Jesus is a myth about a person that they believe was prefigured by early prophets like Isaiah, whose very life and birth was prefigured, who was born of a virgin, the Son of God, rather than man, whose birth was proclaimed by angels to the shepherds, who grew up the son of a carpenter, presumably in poverty, born in a stable, who as a child during the celebration of Passover, this will come back several times, was found in the temple, teaching and listening and being taught by the scribes of the day. He grew in wisdom until as an adult he became a teacher of the law and gave the famous Sermon on the Mount, which most and a large percent of our Western kind of morality and ethics is based on, including the golden rule and the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, forgiving others. He told us that the children should be allowed to come to him because of such is the kingdom of God. We should be humble, like a little child, teachable. According to the stories, he calmed the waves. Even nature itself obeyed his commands. He walked on water. He caused the lame to walk, the blind to see, the deaf to hear. Those who had mental deficiencies and things like epilepsy were healed. He even raised the dead, according to the stories, and Lazarus and Jairus' daughter. And then he entered Jerusalem on Passover, where the people brought palm fronds and shouted, Hosanna, that request for the Messiah to come and save us now, waving the palm. You should recognize this from Sukkot. And then he entered an upper room and had a Passover meal. And in Passover, you drink cups of wine and you eat these pieces of unleavened bread. And in this setting, he said to his disciples, drink, this is my blood, shed for you in a new covenant. Eat, this is my body, which I offer for you. And so this is obviously the origins of the Christian rituals of communion. There he washed the feet of his disciples. And I remember in Passover, washing each other's hands is part of the ritual. You don't wash your own hands, you wash each other's hands. And here he washed the feet of his disciples as a representation of his own humility, the greatest being the least, how he wanted them to behave. Then he went to a garden called Gethsemane, and there he prayed and said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But if it's not possible, let thy will be done. Again, being a representation of humility and of doing what must be done, even if it's something you don't want to do. He was then arrested, betrayed by his own friends with a kiss, brought before Pilate, Herod, back to Pilate, mocked, scourged, beaten, whipped. A crown of thorns were put on his head. The same thorns that infested the ground from the fall of Adam were then placed on his head as a crown. And he was crucified between two thieves and killed. According to the myth, they took him down from the cross, brought him to a tomb where no man had been laid, a rich man's tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, where he was laid in the tomb for 3 days as the Jews measure time, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, because they measure time from the sundown to sunup. And then, as the sun rose on that third day, Easter morning, a Sunday, 2 angels appeared. The stone rolled back from before the mouth of his tomb, and Jesus emerged alive again. He was seen by Mary Magdalene first, a woman, and then later by his apostles, disciples, and according to the story, 500 other people who could testify that they saw him. And last of all, Paul, who says he saw him on a road in a vision many, many years, or months, I don't know, years, I think, later. And the story goes that because Christ rose from the dead, somehow in a way that we don't understand, our sins are forgiven, like the Day of Atonement. I skipped this part. Remember in the Day of Atonement, there are the two lambs. One is cast out and one is sacrificed. When Christ stood before Pilate, two people are brought before him. One named Barabbas, who is set free and leaves, and the other named Christ, who is representation of Jehovah, who is then sacrificed. Again, this is a mirror of the Day of Atonement. And then the entire thing is a mirror of the Passover lamb. Christ is called the Lamb of God because he is the Passover sacrificed for us. And through his sacrifice, presumably our sins can be forgiven, like the Day of Atonement, and we can be brought to life. Our death can be averted, like the children of Israel who were spared because of the blood of the Lamb. And not only did Christ rise from the dead, but our ancestors, our family, our friends, those we have not seen, that we have been missing, ourselves as well, will rise someday from the dead through the act of Christ. He descended into hell and destroyed there Satan and death. Entered into the house of, it's the way the text says it, he entered into the house of the strong man and despoiled his house and set the prisoners free. Meaning he entered into the hell, the land where the dead reign, and set them free. Whether you believe in this myth or not, it is a powerful myth, one that has captured the imagination of thousands and thousands and thousands of people through history and spawned what is probably the largest religion in the world today. And you can see how myth and ritual interplay and interrelate through the way we tell this story. You see, the ritual of the Last Supper informs the ritual of Seder, the Seder at Passover, informs the myth of the Last Supper. It tells us what's happening during that myth, and that myth itself is told to explain and to make use of and reinterpret the Seder. However, then in the death of Christ, now this is again a sense where myth is informing ritual. So the myth of the Passover lamb creates the ritual of the Seder, which then informs the death of Christ and the meaning of the death of Christ. Let's see if I can get my slides to work. We also see how then so here the ritual is informing the myth of Christ. Here the myth of Christ is informing the ritual of the Eucharist, which I believe, John, you're going to have is this true? We're going to have a communion at the end of service? Excellent. So here we have this myth of Christ's Last Supper that then informs the ritual of communion that we're going to do this week. And so
you finally got the transubstantiation down.
Whatever, you can do it now. You can transubstantiate. No, whatever you believe, okay?
No, that's not the miracle like that.
Whatever you believe, whatever you worship, however you think, whether you believe in nothing at all or something, you're welcome here. But whatever you worship and whatever you believe and however you feel about spring, I hope that what we've done today will give you some background in what's happening, from the Easter egg hunts to the communion we will have, whether you're here to remember the new life that comes at spring, or the death of Christ, a myth you believe in or don't, or if you're here just to remember that myth because it's inspiring, whether you believe in it or not. In the things we do today, the Easter egg hunts and the communion, I'm hoping that the stories we've told and the biblical and the extra-biblical and earlier religious background to these stories will help you make those things more meaningful in your life. And I thank you so much for coming. Have some recommended reading. This is America's Favorite Holidays, Candid Histories. Like I said, it's really hard to find good sources for this stuff because most people have an agenda. This is a reasonable source. I recommend it. There's also this web page, which I will link in the video description, so you don't have to sit and write it down, that it was a really good kind of overview of the history of Easter, where it came from, that I thought was useful and at least worth reading. Chuck, you had a comment, and then we got to quit.
It's about the date for Easter. The date for Easter, at least in the West, is set. First there is the spring equinox, and then the first full moon, and the Sunday after the first full moon
That's correct.
Easter. Full moon was Friday, today's Easter.
That's correct.
And I think the Eastern Church still follow things associated with Passover.
So it's still associated with Passover because the first full moon after the equinox is the date of Passover. And so that's how those are connected. And so the first full moon after the equinox is when Passover happens, and then the first Sunday after that is when we have Easter, because Christ rose from the dead as the sun rose on Sunday morning. And that rising of the sun also, by the way, has pagan connections. The Egyptians believed that resurrection, the sun was born every morning and died every night and was resurrected again the next morning. And so the rising of the sun is this symbol of resurrection as well. And so it's a pagan symbol that is borrowed. I mean, any god worthy of his salt and worthy of worship would pay attention to the things people believe and speak to them in their own language. And if people at the time believed that the sun was a symbol of resurrection, he would use the sun as a symbol of resurrection and be resurrected on them. I mean, it has no bearing on whether this myth is true or false, but it does have a pagan interpretation and meaning. So when Easter began to be celebrated, some of them would celebrate it on Passover. Some Christians would celebrate it 3 days after Passover, because Christ was in the tomb 3 days. And some would celebrate it on the first Sunday after Passover. And the reason for that is because Christ rose on Sunday. And there was a debate in the early church about which of those dates is the right way to celebrate Easter. And Constantine in the Council of Nicaea, actually one of the things it did was settle on the first Sunday after Passover as the date for Easter. And but again, there was some disagreement about that. And again, I don't believe getting that right. There are people who believe getting that just right, matters for whether God accepts their Easter celebration. I don't think God cares. But you can pick whatever date you want to celebrate this stuff, and it'll work. But that's kind of the history of how the first Sunday after the equinox was picked. Right, we're out of time. If you have any other comments, questions, come up after, and I will see you next month. Thanks for coming.